Okay, this video is Art of the Ancient Romans, and again, these art videos I'm making here are all leading up to Christianity, and because tomorrow is Easter, okay? And you know, the Romans are part of the lead up to Christianity and whatnot, but basically, I made recent videos about the art of the Old Testament and the art of the ancient Greeks, and what I'm saying here is that the ancient Greeks and the Old Testament both lead into Christ and Christianity, whereas the Romans are different. Rome, you know, people say ancient Greeks and ancient Romans in the same breath, but the ancient Greeks were much better than the ancient Romans. The ancient Romans did some good things. The idea of the Republic was a good thing. They were good at engineering, building aqueducts, and building roads. But for the most part, they were a brutal tyranny, okay? To learn about the Romans, I think the best introductory book, and by the way, I studied lots of history. My life's real boring. I read all the time. Okay, was this one right here, Edith Hamilton, The Roman Way. She is the same lady who wrote about the Greeks, and she's a great writer, really smart lady, okay? So if you want to read one book to get introduced to the Romans, that's the book to start by reading. Just a typical thing, and actually I'm going to talk about Rufus Fears in a moment. He's a great professor over at thegreatcourses.com. This is a typical thing you learn from Rufus Fears, and this is the mindset of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was noble in some ways. Rome had, you know, conquered all these countries in the Mediterranean, and this right here, this guy right here is Horatius. So basically, Rome was fighting with a group of men called the Etruscans, and the Etruscans had got a numerical advantage over Rome and was now set to conquer Rome. So they were charging into Rome, and they wanted to go over this bridge right here. This is called the Pons Sublicius, okay? And Horatius recognized that Rome was screwed if the larger Etruscan army got across that bridge. They would sack Rome and conquer Rome. So at the risk of his life, he stood and fought them while the other Roman men disassembled the bridge and knocked it down so the Etruscan army could not conquer them. Once he had realized that they had successfully knocked down the bridge, he dived into the water, and he actually survived. He had multiple wounds, but he survived, swam to the Roman side. He was a big hero, given a good pension. And he was put forth to the young Roman boys, you know, to be noble like Horatius and defend Rome and all this stuff. So there was a lot of other stuff like that in early Roman history that was kind of brave and proud and strong and noble and kind of badass, you know, like the whole founding of Rome with Romulus and Remus, a lot of stuff like that. This is the guy who's the best lecturer. If you want to just hear lectures on the early Romans, he had a course called Famous Romans, all right? This guy's name is Rufus Fears, PhD. He's the best professor. You've probably heard of thegreatcourses.com, teachingcompany.com. This is their best professor ever in any field. I've listened to about 150 of their other books and programs. He's the best one because he's not only really knowledgeable and smart, he's also really nice and fun, and he knows how to get to the key points, and he's also real emotional and dramatic. He's the best one. He's just a great professor. I bought every single course of him, watched every single video of his. He's just fantastic, okay? Rufus Fears is his name. All right, and then you could also watch some movies, you know, like the one with Cleopatra as Liz Taylor, and, you know, with Richard Burton as Caesar, and then there's, you know, Rex Harrison was Mark Antony. I just tell you that because these movies give you a sense of Rome. Rome is a pretty dramatic place, very big on power, and, you know, it lends itself well to movies. Another movie you might want to watch is Quo Vadis. I'm going to talk about Quo Vadis later in the context of early Christianity, but here on this picture you have Nero, you know, singing, and you could say Nero fiddled while Rome burns. We'll talk about that more in a later video, but that actually historically is a pretty important event. That was in 64 AD, okay, and then he blamed it on the Christians, and he wanted to use that part of Rome that he had burned down to build his own buildings, including a statue of himself, okay? And, you know, it reminded me a little bit of what happened in Hawaii not that long ago, of powerful people taking the land away from the poor to build their own stuff on it, you know, so they can go hide out and have a nice, safe life while everyone else is screwed with the open you-know-what down south over here. Okay, another thing I like about ancient Rome is I like Epictetus. Epictetus was one of the great writers of the Stoic tradition. And here's a typical Epictetus quote. It is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Basically, you can't control the world, but you can only control yourself and your response to it. He was a Greek-born man who was a slave. He was owned by a Roman. But he became a great Stoic philosopher. And Marcus Aurelius, one of the later Roman emperors, was also a Stoic. And Stoicism makes you stronger, sort of accepting the fact that, you can't control life, but you do many things in life, but you do the best you can. And this reminds me of basically saying to yourself, well, instead of being just a whining baby, sour grapes, I'll say, yes, I'm kind of half screwed and I'm disappointed about a lot of things. But at least I'm not 100% screwed like so many people, and I'll be grateful for what I have and make the most of it. Stoicism makes a person stronger. Christianity makes a person stronger. And then the other thing I would say about Rome, to learn about Roman history, the most important person to study is Cicero. Cicero was the greatest orator of Rome, the greatest orator ever in the Latin language. Some people think he was the greatest orator of all time. And he was a lawyer, and Cicero developed a lot of patterns of approaching situations that are useful to anybody. Everybody should study him. The great teacher of rhetoric in Rome was Quintilian, and the greatest scholar of rhetoric ever, performer of rhetoric, was Cicero. It's very compelling when you read his arguments and speeches. He was rather incredible. And the reason why Cicero is so important, too, is he was living right at the time. He sort of rose from relative obscurity into being the ruler of Rome. And he was just an incredible speaker. And he's right at the time of transition between the Republic and the Empire, the death of Julius Caesar, the death of Mark Antony, all these big events. Cicero's fascinating. I've read several books about him and courses about him. He really is interesting. If you only study one thing about Rome and you only want to study one Roman person, you should study Cicero. It will pay you back well for your time. Typical quotes by Cicero. To not know what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child. This painting is Cicero denouncing Catiline. Catiline had caused a lot of trouble in Rome, and he was also a bit of a political opponent of Cicero. And so this painting is him denouncing him in front of and notice how he's sitting by himself, everyone else on the other side. Okay, here's a great quote by Cicero about the decline of the Roman Republic, which he loved so much. The Republic, which reminds me a lot of the great USA, which used to be a proud republic and is now turning into a third world banana republic communist crap hole. Okay, and this quote could be uttered by a modern. He said, "The Republic, when we inherited it, was like a beautiful painting whose colors were already fading with age. But our time not only has neglected to freshen it by renewing the original colors, but has not even bothered to preserve its forms and outlines. What now is left of the ancient customs on which the Commonwealth of Rome was firmly founded? They have been so utterly buried in oblivion that they are no longer practiced. They are not only no longer practiced, but they are forgotten." And that's what I feel like, too, when I talk to all these ignoramuses. They don't know anything about the history of the Founding Fathers. The United States was founded as a Christian country, okay? It was a republic, a God-fearing republic, okay? And now it's fading into oblivion because the citizenry is so ignorant because they've been going to the public schools where they don't learn anything, and they're distracted with nonsense like mathematics. Nobody needs mathematics beyond what you're learning about fourth grade. And the rest, if you're interested, if you become an engineer, you can learn it. Instead, they waste all their time. They could be learning how to start a business, the history of their country, etc., etc. Okay, in the founding of Rome, one of the things they did, they had a lot of men. They were short on women, so they went and stole the women from the Sabines. Okay, so this is the RAPE of the Sabine women by Nicholas Poussin. And there's another painting of it. There's actually a couple other paintings of it that are pretty famous. Here's another version of it. And what I'm trying to say is the modern world is like people grow up thinking the world likes you. And that's a big mistake. The public schools teach that. And because they think the world likes them and is basically a kind, good place, they're such a total bunch of chumps. And that's why, when I have a conversation with somebody from Europe, at least they're from Europe in the sense that they've seen all kinds of terrible things in Europe, Let's say you talk to a person from Poland. They've seen Poland getting their butt kicked by Russia. They've seen Poland getting their butt kicked by Germany, okay? So they've got some sense, or by the Turks, they've got some sense of what could happen. They have some perspective, some ability to see from their perspective. Whereas a typical American doesn't know anything about American history, doesn't know anything about the history of the rest of the world, and you can say, oh, isn't it just a joke? But the sadness is they're so ignorant that they have no ability to behave or vote in an intelligent manner. and they basically welcome all these tyrants. And right now, America is largely ruled in many areas by puppets of tyranny who just do whatever they're told. And all this, diversity, affirmative action stuff is exploited to get puppets into office who will do anything no matter how wrong it is. They have no ability to think for themselves. There's a lot of those in all kinds of minor positions all over the USA, and not only, and also in corporations and stuff too, and it's bad. Okay. All right, here's Charlton Heston. He was the star of the movie Ben-Hur. It's a great movie. It was a book by Lewis Wallace, Ben-Hur, A Tale of Christ. And here he is in a chariot race. It is an awesome chariot scenes, the best chariot scenes ever in a movie. Here's a painting of a chariot race by Jean-Léon Gérôme. He's a great French artist. So pretty exciting stuff. Look at all the people in the Colosseum. So Rome would make these incredible big buildings. They were quite good at engineering. But for example, a typical thing with Rome is they loved the Greeks, and they just adopted Greek mythology and whatnot, and a lot of the Greek literature. Cicero, for example, traveled to Greece and translated a whole bunch of Greek books into Roman. I mean, that's how smart, into Latin. He was so smart he could do that, and he did a lot of good things like that. Okay, here's a painting of Hannibal. He was a Carthaginian general who traveled with elephants over the Alps and to come in and defeat Rome in several battles. He was an incredible general, Hannibal. Okay, he basically kicked the crap out of the Romans every time he fought them. But the Romans were getting crushed by them. This is a picture of Hannibal right here. And he lived from 247 to 181 BC. And here he has just a giant jar filled of rings from Roman soldiers. And there's like over 60,000 of them, okay? It's like, holy crap. He just beat the crap out of the Romans. Okay, so the Romans were frightened. They're afraid that he was going to come and just sack Rome and conquer Rome, and that was going to be the end of Rome. And there was this Roman military guy by the name of Fabius. His full name, Quintus Fabius Maximus. And he said, you know what, we got to forget about going head-to-head with Hannibal. We will never be successful head-to-head with Hannibal. The guy's just a genius, and we can't fight him head-to-head. We can't fight him that way. So he came up with what is now known as the Fabian strategy. It's used when fighting a more powerful foe to sort of weaken them. And basically he would disrupt their supply lines, try to demoralize Hannibal and his men. And it was a bit of a scorched earth policy to make no food available to them, to avoid a large open-scale conflict in which they thought Hannibal was sure to win. And by this strategy, they sort of, deprived Hannibal of what he wanted, a big, decisive victory. And this enabled them to win over Hannibal and conquer Carthage, okay? And to some extent, GW used this in the founding of the United States against the Brits. And it's something to be aware of when one is weaker, okay? So that is the Fabian strategy. Now, the Romans also had another leader, Scipio, and this would be like a typical Roman thing. Scipio conquered, this one area, and he said, and basically the soldiers, brought Scipio, a pretty young lady, says, she's all yours, enjoy her. And that's a pretty common thing in military. When an army conquers, the head leader gets first pick of the babes, and then the soldiers get whatever's left over. And so they brought her to Scipio, and she was like engaged. I think this was her fiance, this young guy. And the parents of the girl went to Scipio, and they offered him all these presents, all their wealthy, jewelry and pottery and brass or whatever their cookware was. And Scipio said, no, you can keep the girl and you can keep all your money and your gifts. And that was a sign of Roman being magnanimous. And Rome often did do stuff like that. They also often were completely brutal and evil. But I show you this because this was Rome's mind. A lot of times when you have a conquering group, they like to see themselves as being good. They say, well, yes, we conquered these places, but it was for their own interest because now we civilize them. Like England used to think it was benefiting these countries when it would conquer them because it's going to civilize them. And to some extent, other empires have often been like that, including the USA. I'm pretty well familiar with the history of Puerto Rico and what they did to Puerto Rico. Okay, and I'm quite familiar with what the Brits did to the Irish when they brutalized them and tried to pretend they were doing them a favor. But anyways, this is kind of a famous painting, and I'm just showing the logic of that. And what's bizarre about it is, you see, look at the logic of it, that it's expected that he would take the women of their place, okay? And that's just what armies have done all throughout the world traditionally. Not nice, okay? And here's a little more insight into the mentality of the Romans. This is Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar was a military genius. The guy was incredible. He basically kicked the crap out of the Gauls, sort of the people of France of that time, kind of related to the Celts and whatnot. And this guy, Vercingetorix, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Vercingetorix, was a brilliant guy. He was a great leader, but they just were outpowered by the Roman army led by Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar wrote famous commentaries. People who read them said they were absolutely brilliant and incredible, his ability to write and think in Latin. But he was also pretty brutal. Obviously, the Gauls were afraid of him. I don't know how many he killed of them. It was like close to 1,000,000 of them, which is a lot, especially in those days. Vercingetorix was then paraded as a prisoner, a trophy of war in Rome, paraded through the streets, and later on he was killed. But this kind of shows you the mentality of Julius Caesar. And, he was sort of bloodthirsty thug who wanted to distinguish himself as a leader. And I'm showing you this just to give you a sense of what Rome's like. When you read Roman history, it's endless conquest, battles, brutality, cruelty. It's really not that pleasant to read. Schopenhauer had talked about the two histories, the history of the will and the history of the arts and civilization. And it's a great pleasure to read the history of the arts and civilization, all these new discoveries and thoughts and ideas. It's beautiful. Versus the history of the will is the history of might, power, conquest, and it's full of evil, bad things. Then here is Cleopatra, beautiful woman. She was also brilliant. She spoke a bunch of languages, and all the powerful men that encountered her fell in love with her. Julius Caesar's in love with her. Here he is giving her that shy wave, and she sees him as Mr. Power in Rome. Okay, but Julius Caesar didn't stick around for too long. He got accused of trying to, want to be a king. Brutus and Cassius led a group of men to take care of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, March 15, in 44 BC. Okay, and there's lots of paintings of this. So here's another painting, Death of Julius Caesar by William Holmes Sullivan. His purple robe is not enough to protect him there. Here's another one. This is by all these famous artists of paintings of the Romans. By Jean-Léon Gérôme, The Death of Caesar. And of course, there was a Julius Caesar play that's read in freshman year of high school at most high schools in USA. Here's another just painting by Carl von Pelotti. So all these paintings are what happened to Julius Caesar. And basically, I think the reason why they have freshmen in high school read it is because they want to discourage them from ever reading any other book again in their life. They're just not emotionally ready to read Julius Caesar. Great Expectorations by Charles Dickens is absolute by far his worst book. Then they have to force them to read To Kill a Mockingbird, which basically is an indirect way to say, you're racist, you're racist, you're racist. And what they're trying to do is make these children hate reading, and they succeed at it. And once these American kids get through their freshman year of high school, most of them, other than for school, never read another book again in their life. And it's kind of sad and unfortunate. I got to sometimes try to fix this webcam by going up close to it, then it'll often reset itself. Let's see if that works. Maybe, maybe not. All right, so anyways, that's a statue of Augustus, the statue of Augustus, and he was, it worked that time, he was then the great leader of Rome and the transition figure who took Rome into becoming an empire instead of being a republic. And he was also Octavian. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and he was victorious over Pompey, victorious over Mark Antony. Pretty good statue there. You can see the Romans were pretty good at that. And then Virgil the poet wrote the Aeneid, which is about the founding of Rome. And Octavia, her son had died recently, and sort of when Virgil read his poem getting near that part, she was very sad and she fainted. Okay, and here's Augustus right here. Okay. And the Aeneid is still a pretty good thing. It's a little bit, propaganda, if you will, but it's still a pretty good epic. All right, of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey for the Greeks, Iliad and the Odyssey for the Greeks, are the most famous epics. And Paradise Lost is an epic, but the Aeneid is also pretty good. The whole story of Aeneas and how he split up with Dido and Carthage. I didn't have time to get all those paintings, but it's kind of a good stuff. Here she is fainting again, very sad. Okay, and during Augustus' reign, Jesus Christu was born. And it kind of reminds me, a little bit of USA, Rome, sort of this brutal, tyrannical, in many ways evil place. And then there's some hope. Hope with Christ. Okay, here's this woman being dragged by her hair, things like that in Rome. Cruelty to slaves, selling of slaves, okay, in a big way. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Greeks did have some slaves, but they had moved away from it in many ways. The Greek was a city and a country going up, 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 and did all kinds of incredibly good, innovative things. Yes, it had some problems, but tons of good stuff came out of ancient Greece. Theater, philosophy, biology, all kinds of good stuff. Literature, philosophy, oh man, Plato's Republic, all kinds of good stuff. Now I want to show you some of the problems that Rome had later. Rome kind of messed with all its neighbors and wanted to expand as far as it could. And it ran into the barbarians of what we now call Germany, who were pretty good at resisting them. This was the great battle of Teutoburg Forest, okay? And this guy was a leader, Arminius. Arminius was the barbarian tribal leader, and he actually had been trained by the Romans in the Roman army with Varus. So Varus was the Roman general leading his legions under, Augustus was the empire. This was right, in the early part of Anno Domini, okay? And so he understood the tactics of the Roman military. And basically he knew that in an open field they would crush anybody. But he also knew in a forest with narrow paths where his men knew the terrain much better than them and they had the high ground and the element of surprise on their side, they kicked the crap out of the Roman guy Varus and his legions. This is a picture of Arminius saying goodbye to his wife Thusnelda before going to the Battle of Teutoburg. Okay, this painting here. All right, so this is a pretty big famous event. And this event where he kicked the crap out of Varus and destroyed his legions, it made Rome hesitate. So they didn't venture beyond the Rhine because they were scared of the barbarians because they were surprised that the barbarians could kick their butts so badly. Okay. And this is a monument to Arminius there. Okay, later on though, a couple years later, the Romans got a better general. This guy's name was Germanicus, and he was more informed of what was going on. And Germanicus, even though his name is Germanicus, he's actually a Roman general. He successfully took back some of the areas that had been conquered by Arminius. And these are the old bodies of Roman soldiers in the forest that had been still remaining and from the tree and whatnot. And once he conquered them, they gained back some of their eagles that they had been taken from them by the men of Arminius. And I'm showing you this just to give you a sense of what Roman history is like. It's like this over and over, endlessly, battle after battle after battle. These are just some ones where they made a lot of nice paintings. Okay, here's Thusnelda, the wife of Arminius, and their son. And basically, she was captured by Germanicus. Here's Germanicus up here. And again, he wanted to show his magnanimity, and he didn't just bump her off right away. But it was a way of Rome showing how powerful they were. Okay. All right, and just, to show you the spectacle of ancient Rome. Here are the gladiators fighting in the Colosseum, and the crowd in this case has put thumbs down to finish off the defeated gladiator here. It's called Thumbs Down. This guy, Jean-Léon Gérôme, French artist, did a lot of nice paintings about the ancient Romans. But it just shows you the brutality of it. And this reminds me, too, I think that UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championships, have sort of been expanded in a way. They want America, the billionaires who run the world want America to copy many of the things that were happening during the fall of Rome, to be decadent, hedonistic, lazy. All of this stuff facilitates, just like it facilitated the downfall of Rome, it facilitates the downfall of the USA. So there's a lot of parallels to it. I remember, too, when I was searching online to read about the fall of Rome, it was amazingly hard to find stuff. I'm not kidding. The stuff was literally shadow, hidden bond. because they made it hard to find. Because I read all these audiobooks and stuff about the fall of Rome. I was curious about it. But they made it 10 times harder than it should have been to find it. I was surprised by that. But I've noticed that as a pattern. Anything that empowers proles is hidden or partially banned or diminished in some way. Just like, you go to an article, a journal article, to find something to help the proles, and it'll typically be hidden behind a paywall. You might only get an abstract, and you not even get an abstract, okay? Versus something that gives power to the corporations, you'll get the whole article for free anywhere. All right, so here's a painting by this guy, Lawrence Alma-Tadema, also painted a lot of great stuff from the ancient Greeks and Romans. And here he's, painting everybody at the Colosseum. It's their big day. Look how amazing this big building is. And, the Romans were advanced engineers of that time. Again, all this stuff is leading up to Christ, but I'm giving you the background so later on, when we talk about other things or you think about these other things, you'll have this background. Here's Marcus Aurelius, and he was one of the relatively good Roman emperors, but I'm not a big fan of him. He was pretty cruel to the Christians. He really didn't give a rat's tail about them. He didn't go out of his way to be cruel, but he certainly went along with it. Marcus Aurelius, equestrian statue of him, and he's the guy who wrote, the Marcus Aurelius Meditations on Stoicism, basically. And he tried to be a good emperor, okay? But this is Marcus Aurelius on his deathbed, and he had an adopted son, sort of an adopted heir, named Commodus. And Commodus wished he was a gladiator, and he had big negative consequences for Rome. This is Commodus. He later became emperor, and here he is leading the gladiators out of the Colosseum one day. And he just didn't have that much talent as a gladiator in some ways. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this is a painting of the gladiators leaving the Colosseum by Edwin Blashfield. All right, so now I just want to show you, this movie was a really good movie with Russell Crowe called The Gladiator. In this movie, Russell Crowe was the gladiator. His name was Maximus, and he was a true friend of the former emperor Marcus Aurelius. Forced to compete then with after the death of Marcus Aurelius with the adopted heir Commodus, who in a sense had usurped the throne in some ways. But if you want to get a sense of the brutality of ancient Rome and what it was like, I think this is a pretty good movie. There's a lot of other books about the history of Rome and DVD courses, video courses. Greatcourses.com has a lot of good stuff along those lines. I went through those other courses, and I thought they were good too, but Rufus Fear was head and shoulders better than the other courses. I listened to all these courses on the emperors and habits of the Romans, etc., etc. Okay, there was also a lot of decadence. Some of these Roman emperors, they basically insisted on having a new woman every day. And that's why you don't want a ruler to have total power, because if you give a guy total power, he's going to want more power and he's going to want more women. All right, that's just how men have behaved traditionally. And you need something in place to restrain them, okay? Christianity restrains men, okay? Having a wife restrains men. Okay, so anyways, this would be typical of the Roman decadence. Like I said, some of the Roman emperors insisted on having a different woman forced to have sex with them every day. All right, then you had this crazy emperor Caligula, and he loved his horse so much that he decided his horse should be a member of the Senate, like a consul. Okay, so he pushed to try to get that achieved. So the consul senators were, aristocrats, the patricians, versus the regular people, are plebeians, the commoners, okay? And Caligula got bumped off in about 41 AD. He pissed a lot of people off for multiple reasons. Some say he was just doing it as a joke, but either as a joke or for real, it was not something appreciated by his contemporaries. Rome, as we said, was a great builder. All the roads lead to Rome in many, many ways. And, here's their pantheon. Pan meaning all, theon meaning to religion, to God. So pantheon meaning all the gods celebrated here under this great big dome with the oculus that lets light in and water. Okay, here's another painting by this guy, Giovanni Paolo Panini. Just sort of these big things from Rome, these like obelisks, the Colosseum, looks like the statue of the wounded Gaul, discus thrower. And that's a pretty big thing of Western civilization, a love of art, sculpture, and architecture. And that's one of the great contributions it has made to civilization overall. Here's the famous statue of Marcus Aurelius, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. This looks to me like a statue of Hercules. And this right here is the fire of Rome. This happened in 64 AD, and this was started by Nero. And we'll talk about this later in a separate video. on early Christianity, but I just wanted you to see it because the whole business with Nero, he basically burned down a very large part of Rome so he could have more land available to build stuff for himself, including a big statue of himself. Okay, this painting is by Hubert Robert from 1785. And then he blamed the fire on the Christians, and he brutalized the Christians after that. Okay, so that'll be the end of our talk for today. I hope that was helpful and interesting.